Can I encourage you, first of all, to remember that this meeting is being recorded. Please do engage in the chat and add your questions in there. There will be an opportunity to ask questions later on in the session, but please do feel free to contribute in the chat throughout the discussion. Hopefully we can get a lively interchange going on there. And obviously, please do mute yourself while the speakers are speaking. So without further ado, our first speaker, who we're absolutely delighted to have with us, is Lindsay Maguire from the Cabinet Office, who is going to kick us off. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Anne. Thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Okay, great. Yes, hello everyone. Thanks so much for the invite. I thought I actually went back and watched the previous one of these that we did when the Act had just, kind of got its royal assent, to see how far away or how close to the sort of messaging. And we were just discussing in the sort of virtual green room before we started the call that it has been quite a long journey. And I think that is fair. I've been working on this for 4.5 years. Some of my colleagues slightly longer. We also found our very first Daily Telegraph headline of Boris announces a destruction of EU red tape, which obviously was kind of a prime post-EU exit rhetoric. And we went back and looked at that, and we kind of figured out where we actually kind of ended up. So I think we're very much in the space of, we know it's not a revolution, we know it's an evolution. We know it's taken a little bit of time, and part of that is because procurement is so important. It took a lot of time to go through the Houses of Parliament, because it attracted so much interest in various things, which on the face of it are not really anything to do with procurement. So we spent a lot of time looking at those ancillary questions and those huge kind of questions which are affecting the whole of the country. But I do feel like we've ended up with something which is a really good opportunity and a really good platform for our function. So what I would say in terms of next steps is, firstly, I'm going to go on holiday for a little bit because I need one, I can promise you. But we've got quite a nice platform now, and it's up to the public sector to make use of some of those flexibilities that we've introduced. I genuinely think there is a huge opportunity to work with the marketplace, to work with industry on tackling some of our commercial challenges and building those commercial outcomes. For me, this has always been a significant driver, but it's actually linked really nicely into what the new government has set out in terms of the missions. So if you look at all of the narrative around mission delivery and mission focused government, procurement has got such a role to play in that, in terms of deriving those commercial outcomes with industry. And this is huge. So all of the narrative around driving innovation and working with suppliers and meeting, those kind of tricky elements around risk mitigation and risk balancing, the Procurement Act enables that. Having said that, it is just an enabler. So a lot of the next steps do need to come from those commercial teams in driving this forward. And that I'm really looking forward to seeing various case studies. One slight misconception, and I completely understand that people are excited about the flexibility, is obviously the flip side of this is being more efficient and more streamlined around some of the tactical stuff that we buy. So better use of frameworks, better use of tools, better leverage across the whole of the public sector. And we've done quite a few things to navigate that. The other thing that I would say, and I had quite an interesting conversation on this the other day, is that actually a lot of the compliance, and I appreciate compliance is important, and we'll have lawyers looking at the compliance around this, but a lot of the compliance within the Act is all about making sure that we're using that as a hook for good commercial and supplier management. So things like KPIs, we are interested in what the KPIs say in the contract, but actually having those KPIs is also a good opportunity to remind everyone that you need to be talking to your supplier about their KPIs in that contract management journey. So there's lots of soft things throughout the Act which are actually behavioural and are actually quite a good opportunity to navigate in terms of that cultural change. So finally, I have got lots to say, but I'm really, really interested to hear what everybody else has got to say, and I can answer any questions going through. I do think this is a catalyst to change, like it's a moment for our function, and we're really keen to kind of build on the momentum of change and all of that positivity that has come beyond it. I'm absolutely certain there'll be plenty of debate about transparency, about burdens, about what this means, about how to get the most of procurement. But ultimately, this is quite a good opportunity for us all to kind of come together and think about how we're driving forward some of those really positive behaviours in the future. All right, that was my 6 minutes. I'll pass that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lindsay, and exemplary timekeeping too to get us off on a good footing. So well done you. Over now to Jane Lynch from Cardiff University.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lindsay. I agree with everything that you've said so far, and certainly deserve a holiday, as do a lot of other people, I'm sure, right now. It's a very exciting time, and yeah, following the journey of its development and listening to the debates and the consultation process, you know, it's something to be really applauded and something that in the UK we can be very proud of, I think. But I think let's think about what the title of this this webinar is really, what next? And I think what next for me in 6 minutes highlights two cautions. One is that this is all happening at the time when budget cuts are real. And we're looking at something like a 2 billion shortfall in funds for local authorities across the board in the UK. And I was only talking to somebody today, and they were talking about a 65 million deficit that they've got to try and address within 3 years. So that kind of raises some concerns about the expectations of chief executives, because procurement is now very much in the spotlight, and that we don't want them to think that procurement can now address everything. So I think I wanted to say that one as kind of the first caveat and caution that, you know, is really at the top of my mind. But really, mainly, I want to just mention the issue around SMEs, but particularly micro and small businesses. So I think with this new change that's happening in procurement, how are we going to convince the supply market that the public door is wide open and opportunities are going to be available to them that perhaps weren't available to them previously? And by that, I'm talking about not necessarily the SME category, but the micro and small business category. If we look at the latest statistics on small businesses, 99.2% of businesses in the United Kingdom employ less than 50 people. We've got an incredibly fragmented supply chain. And if we really want to make the public purse have an impact on the local business community, but also people that need it most in our local communities, then we've really got to be ensuring that the public procurement is going to be able to address some of the shortcomings that we've seen previously. So I think this is a really important matter to address. How are we going to reach these businesses and convince them that its businesses has changed? And I think that's a really important matter. I think we've still got, you know, we might have new legislation, but we've still got the same capacity in procurement. We've still got people with relatively the same skills, even though we'd like to think that everybody's now been through the training and understands the Act and the license to be able to do things differently. But that doesn't just come overnight. That's going to take time. So I think, you know, really from the small business community, how do we convince them that things are going to change? And that these opportunities are there, because, you know, we're publishing that thousands of businesses are going to be benefiting from this new procurement legislation. How are we going to fulfill that promise in terms of our communication and how we reach that supply market? So that, to me, how we overcome stigma, past bad experiences, how do we create a culture of ambition to make sure that small businesses realise that there are opportunities out there to support them to grow their business. One of the biggest challenges of small businesses bidding for public contracts previously is their ability to scale up and scale up quickly. So, you know, what are we going to do to try and help and address that? So I guess really in my 6 minutes, I think that's about it. I think I'm pretty tight there. That's what I'd like to highlight so far. Thank you, and invite questions on that later.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jane. Next up, it's Staying in Wales with Richard Dooner from the Welsh Local Government Association.
Thank you very much. And well, hello, I'm Richard from Pembrokeshire, and I do procurement. Now, that's usually about as far as I can get before the other person glazes over. The more sophisticated types might feign interest and ask me what procurement is. And I can tell you from long experience that it's wise to be very careful how you answer that, get it right, and you can be into some lively and stimulating conversations. Get it wrong, and it gets tedious very quickly. So I come to this panel determined not to be tedious, and if I fail, it's only 4 minutes to Kieran, so pretend a little bit of interest, please, for me. So here we are. We're 2 working days into the implementation of the Procurement Act. Councils have been preparing for this. Back on the 5th of February, we had a golden hour with our network of procurement practitioner leads, a final polish before the event, and we asked if they were ready. As ready as we can be, they said. So today, well, if at this point you also do procurement and you've got the capacity to be here, it must be going reasonably well so far. And if it isn't, try to eat well, get an early night. You're going to need all of your energy tomorrow. But whatever the experience, it's early days. We're going to know more going forward. New systems, new regimes, never easy. There will be risks, and none more so than the very real risk that the reforms don't do what they were intended to do. The new national policy statement makes the intentions clear. It sets out the UK government's strategic priorities for public procurement, and it outlines how contracting authorities can support their delivery. There are a couple of things in the national procurement statement that I'd like to highlight. The first of these is the management of below threshold contracts. We do a lot of those. Now, these might be reserved for local small business and social enterprise, and there's now a duty under the Procurement Act for contracting authorities to consider access to tenders and contracts for small and voluntary businesses. And we're looking forward to seeing the application of the UK government policy notes. It's PPN 05 for those of you who want to look it up. We're also intrigued by the new public interest test for contracting authorities to assess at the outset of a procurement process whether the work should be outsourced or if it can be done more effectively and drive better value for money in-house. A good pre-procurement process should always consider modal options, make or buy, but it doesn't always happen, and it isn't always a level playing field when it does. It'll be interesting to see whether this new test changes that. In Wales, we also have what I believe to be an underestimated but potentially game-changing piece of legislation, the Social Partnerships and Public Procurement Act. This was passed in late 2023, and we're working on getting it into force early next year. It does things like social partnership and socially responsible procurement. The clue really is in the name. And it's also mandating contract management duties to ensure socially responsible outcomes through the supply chains. So final point from me for now, and it's about collaboration. One of the advantages of being Wales, apart from having a big red dragon on our flag, is that we're small enough to afford a close relationship between our institutions, including local and central government. And I think policy implementation gets interesting when we go from central to local. Councils have been described as the delivery arm of central government, but that's a mistaken premise. Councils have their own democratic leadership, and each has its own policies and priorities, which are just as important as those in the centre and just as ambitious. Fortunately for me, the expectations of central and local leadership for procurement in England and Wales are broadly similar, and the various policy statements reflect that. The challenge is how we exceed those expectations, which is what I need the new procedures to help us with, because it's what we're intending to do. Thank you, and over to you, Kieran.
Actually, I'm going to do a slight change in the running order and go next to Kate because she's on her travels.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Kieran, I'm worried about my connection later on in the call. So I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to pick up on Lindsay's opportunity to talk about compliance and the future of what that looks like under the Act. And I think there are two main areas where our clients in the market that we deal with is looking at what next. And the first is an enormous focus on the new exclusion and debarment regime, and where people feel there's an enormous amount of scope for perhaps political pressure or wider kind of public policy pressure for the first debarment, and where we think that will happen. And that's obviously something that has had a lot of discussion to date, but that is really where I think people want to understand how those decisions are going to be taken in practice, what the minister will investigate, who will put onto those lists, and how that will be used in the future. And that is, that is not a negative thing. That's not to say that that should be something to be frightened of. And it's Lindsay's point, I think, very well made. And actually, both Jane and Richard spoke about it as well, is this is a huge opportunity and it should be considered in that light. But for people who are worrying about uncertainty, that is an enormous consideration for them in terms of what next. And I think it is a real opportunity to get proper engagement in relation to exclusion and debarment, and to use it for exactly what it should be intended to use, which is to actually lead to good procurement rather than any kind of punitive regime, which I think is actually how it's meant, I understand, and it's also how it should be perceived in the market. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is obviously litigation. No, it's one of the areas, and Lindsay has spoken about this a lot, and actually Jane and I have spoken about this recently as well. It's one of the areas where there was an opportunity for quite a holistic change in terms of the mechanism to have a review body or kind of something like the Competition Appeals Tribunal, and we don't have that. So what we have here is still going to the High Court for disputes. And there is a feeling that perhaps those disputes won't particularly change day one. Because of that, there hasn't been a wholesale change in the remedies regime, but it's the points around things like KPIs where people see there might be a change in the future. So if you have procurement looking into contract performance, then you have it starting to look into a whole new area and whole new realm, again, in a really positive way. But there is a kind of the possibility through the transparency that sits around that and the reporting.
Sorry, Kate, we've just lost your audio for a second. No.
Excellent.
Ah, there you are.
Back again?
Yes, you are back again. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry about that. I thought the internet would be more stable here, perhaps. But anyway, I think what I was saying was that KPIs are not only a fantastic opportunity for transparency, but also potentially a route to challenge. And I think that is the other area of what next. So the evolution of that transparency and that data point in terms of kind of holding the market to account, and also people looking to their competitors and bringing challenges on that basis. I'll stop there, Anne, in case my connection goes again.
It was just a temporary blip, so we got all your points loud and clear. Thank you very much indeed, Kate. Now I will go to Kieran. Kieran.
Yes, thank you very much, Anne, and hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be back again at the POGO Club. For anyone I haven't met before, my name is Kieran McGahey. I'm a consultant solicitor and procurement law trainer. So today we're going to be looking at UK Procurement Act. What goes live now? What? Well, my now what is going to be record keeping. Conscious that's not the most exciting topic you're going to hear today, but on the plus side, I've only got 4 or 5 minutes, so do bear with me. So I was recently asked to provide my top tip for contracting authorities on applying the new regime. That tip was get on top of your record keeping. For me, the successful and compliant application of the new rules is going to need to entail good record keeping, better record keeping in a lot of cases, if we're being brutally honest. Now, record keeping in public procurement law, rather, it's nothing new. We've seen lots of case law under the existing regime, which emphasises that importance. Two which immediately spring to mind are the Energy Solutions versus the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, the Lancashire Care cases, which I think evidence the fact record keeping is particularly important for evaluation and moderation. But I think under the Procurement Act, it's going to become more important at other stages right throughout the procurement life cycle. And I include within that the contract phase, which Kate helpfully touches upon, which I think is one of the key areas of change. So I think the new regime is really going to represent a step up for contracting authorities in terms of their record keeping. Well, why do I say that? First up, many of you in the call will no doubt be familiar with the EU treaty principles. Previously, it still feels weird to say previously, enshrined in Regulation 18 of the Public Contracts Regulations, equal treatment, transparency, and so on. Under the new UK regime, those principles are largely replaced by objectives. We have our new objectives in Section 12, value for money, maximising public benefit, etc., etc. But the relevant obligation also changes in terms of those principles or objectives. These are not matters which we must, strictly adhere to or apply. Rather, a contracting authority must have regard to the importance of them, or sometimes just have regard, depending on which particular objective. Likewise, we've heard about the new National Procurement Policy Statement, which introduces a further have regard duty, which didn't appear in our previous regulations. So this new duty around having regard or having regard to the importance of, for me, that's an important change in UK public procurement. And it's an obligation focused on an obligation focused on process rather than a defined outcome. So it's going to be very important, particularly when faced with some of the legal challenges potentially that Kate touched upon, that a contracting authority is able to demonstrate their consideration. So having that robust audit trail, already important, going to become even more important. Secondly, the Act brings stricter rules around conflicts of interest. Now, authorities will need to create a formal conflicts assessment using the individual declarations, which hopefully should have already, from the relevant people acting in that procurement. Allegations of conflict of interest can be quite fertile terrain for legal challenges. So again, will be eminently sensible for contracting authorities to have those assessments in place from the outset and to be keeping them under review. Thirdly and finally, we have the new focus on contract management and indeed contract performance. Kate, I think, helpfully touched upon the new rules on KPIs, key performance indicators for certain contracts above £5 million. Now, the authority then need to assess such performance publicly at least once a year. Now, you can just imagine the potential headlines that might bring for all parties where contractual performance is not going fantastically well. So in order to make that assessment, in order to be able to justify that assessment, record keeping during the contract stage is also going to be absolutely crucial. So to summarize then, from my perspective, the Act introduces some important changes, new terminology, new concepts like the debarment list we heard Kate speak about earlier, new flexibilities like Lindsay mentioned, but record keeping remains an essential tool from my perspective to evidence compliance and reduce the risk of legal challenge. And I think that's going to be the case now more than ever. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kieran. Next up, Michael Bowsher.
Thank you, Anne. The headline for what I was going to say was, maybe it will all be great. Half the points I was going to make are being covered in the chat, so that enables me to be even quicker. Lindsay's already touched on the fact that there is a sort of interesting or problematic tension in the way this legislation started. Because it was a Brexit measure and it started from the Johnsonian bonfire period, one approach to it is very much it's all change. We don't need these rules. Slim everything down to the minimum required. On the other hand, a sort of quite contrary pressure has come in right from the outset. I mean, it was clear from a few days after the referendum that whatever happened, we were going to have to work within the GPA. Then we had the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on top of that. So whatever the bonfire approach might have led to, we've had layered onto it requirements to put in quite a lot of regulation, which we might otherwise have got rid of, and then on top of that, it's been layered in what I will loosely call lots of interesting and good ideas. So we've ended up with actually quite a heavy burden of regulation, all for very good reasons. But I think what worries me here at this particular moment is that I wonder whether we missed the chance, and all of us missed the chance to sort of sit down and really think about whether or not dare I say it, Boris Johnson was right, and we should have just gone back to a blank sheet of paper. Now, maybe that was never legally possible because of the constraints that we worked in, but we've ended up with an awful lot in this legislation. And why have I started getting cold feet about this? Well, procurement law has always had a very special history of compliance. Clients on both sides of the transaction, public authorities, tenderers, and civil society, have often viewed procurement law as an area where flexible compliance was in order, and some authorities and tenderers, frankly, seemed to almost, for many years, to regard compliance as optional. Questions that would be passed to lawyers about procurement law were often of the type which they would never dare to have asked of competition law, because procurement law the attitude seemed to be, well, procurement laws, there's just too much of it and it's too complicated and it can't really mean what it says. So let me ask and see if I can find a way around it. And I have been saying for years, if not decades, that if only our procurement law would be in the form of a statute, people would take it more seriously. And maybe that was, I think that on reflection was perhaps naive. I hope not. But certainly in the last few weeks and months, the tenor of some of the questions which have come to me have suggested that at least some entities, quite a few entities, continue to take a rather broad brush approach to compliance. Now, let's see whether or not that gets corrected. But I am worried that we, by layering in such a heavy degree of compliance, which a lot of authorities are really worried about in terms of cost and administrative burden. It's not just on the transparency side, which Kieran has talked about on other occasions, but also these really important features around contract management and performance and KPI management, which I think are really important going forward if we're going to deliver good public procurement. But I do wonder whether some of this stuff really needed to be in legislation, and whether by putting it in legislation and imposing some of the additional cost that flows from that, we may actually have had it may turn out that we've actually undermined some of the goals that we wanted to achieve. There are a number of features, some of which have already been touched on. I don't really see anything in all of the various recent material which is going to change the direction of travel towards frameworks. The Public Accounts Committee has reported on this many times recently. The move towards frameworks in all sorts of sectors of public commerce obviously tends to work against SMEs. And again, recently, largely, I'll put in my plug here, largely as a result of having done my Oxford University Law Tech program on AI and the law, I'm beginning to feel that I begin to have glimmerings of understanding of what might be going on in some of the AI tools. And I do wonder whether or not, in fact, AI is going to be a force magnifier for larger bidders. Rather than I know there's been some who thought AI would equalize the playing field in favor of SMEs. And I have to say, I'm rather worried it's going to have the contrary effect. So anyway, this is almost me being worried and so it's hence my heading, maybe it will all be great. But I think there are quite a few things we need to watch. And maybe the takeaway I would ask someone to do, and I'm not sure that this is necessarily on anyone's program yet, is to really monitor compliance over the next year or two. And we didn't have this built into the legislation in the way that it was sometimes done in the directives, but it would be useful in say 18 months' time to take a view as to where we've gone and which bits, frankly, have not had the effect that was intended, or have just been ignored, and whether or not, frankly, we should just have a bit of a revision and do without them. Because I think there may be some cleaning up that could usefully be done in a couple of years' time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. So plea for us to be back here in 18 months' time, having another conversation about this act and how it's gone. But for present purposes, moving on to our final panelist, last but not least, our very own Rory MacDonald.
Hi, everyone. Hope you'll forgive me for joining the panel instead of just helping facilitate. I want to talk a little bit about mission-driven government and social value. It's come up a few times, particularly the National Public Procurement Statement, NPPS. It's striking that we've got an NPPS, it's referenced in the Act, and there are now public procurement notices and PPNs that sort of build upon that framework. So reading them all together, I think is helpful. I want to say very briefly comment on the sort of users of information, a capacity gap that needs to be addressed, and a transparency gap that still may need to be addressed. What's striking is when talking about procurement, very often we're very drawn to the award process, the sort of theater of the bidders and the awards, and that makes sense. Particularly if you're someone who is trying to win an award, but increasingly we're seeing that there's more attention to things way before the actual award and then way after the award. Think of notices, think of pipeline notices very early. Think of the requirement, if you're doing social value, to engage with the market and try and understand what it is that suppliers can do related to social value for a particular activity. And then afterwards, Kate's talked about performance, and the need for, now we've got KPIs in some contracts. So this is all activity afterwards. So a lot more attention to activity way before the award and way after the award. I think that's potentially a major shift here. Regarding users of the information, Kieran's talked about the importance of keeping good records. We've talked a lot about sort of producing notices. There are a lot more users of that information that could be brought into the fold. Civil society is an important user of the information. There are lots of civil society organizations that are really good at tackling issues like giving people homes, getting people jobs. There are lots of organizations that might need to be interested in what the notices say. Of course, there are accountability organizations that are also curious about the information, and then there are public managers who may need to sort of figure out, well, what's going on in my area. So there are a lot more users of the information, and the benefits of the user benefits, I think, need as much attention as potentially the burdens on just keeping the records. So there's a lot more engagement with users of the information that's important. I think there's still going to be a capacity gap that needs to be addressed. Jane talked about the resourcing challenges, but if you are doing more things before a particular procurement and doing more things long after the procurement, then these are new skills, these are potentially new roles. For example, after the procurement, if your contractor has promised lots of things related to jobs or has promised lots of things related to sustainability, are our contract managers the best people to do that? Do they have the capacity? I always remember a local government person saying to me that they had to have an argument with the contract manager who refused to acknowledge that they in fact were the contract manager. No, I'm not the contract manager. Yes, you are. So that kind of thing happening, doesn't bode well for, holding contractors to account for social value promises that they may have made. Okay, also the transparency gap to be addressed. There are lots more notices now, including KPIs. There's also the lots in the National Procurement Policy Statement and and a new social value model in PPN number 2. But these things are not yet connected. There's not yet information really about progress towards social value commitments included in the notices in a structured way that you might see. There are hints of it within the new social value model. There are suggested outcomes within the government's mission-driven government. There's some talk of milestones in there. I see in the future these things being hopefully more connected. Small business spend targets. This is exciting for a lot of people. I think under the first PPN, organizations are meant to set targets for spending with BCSEs and small businesses. getting that information and getting that information out, I think, will remain a challenge. But for many people, that's very exciting. One thing I did say, the requirement to do, if you're promising lots of jobs being created, there's a requirement now to, use the government's job sites to create those. That's the kind of thing that may drive more transparency. And I note that the standard clauses for services contracts have been updated to include that requirement to publish your jobs in the in the government's job site. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I think the progress is being made with transparency, but more needs to be made. And then I think there's something around commercial sensitivity, the idea of what is commercially sensitive. Are the offerings of contractors to do something in social value, whether it's new jobs or something in the area, should that be commercially should that be confidential, or is that got more sort of broad society public interest that we should have more access to? Anyway, I think there's lots more to happen as it relates to sort of social value and transparency and this sort of shift towards mission-driven government. I agree with all the concerns that others have, but I'm also optimistic that some of this stuff will continue to develop. Some concerns, though, frameworks are not covered by this. I think that'll probably increase. There is an increasing trend towards the use of frameworks. Certainly in the US, we've seen a massive, frameworks are very much used. And then speaking of the US, all these America First policies and the use of, the current administrations, using contracts and pausing contracts and studying contracts for DEI policies, that kind of stuff is, alarming. So while personally I'm excited about the policies that the current government is putting into procurement, and it's interesting to study those, and I'm very curious about those working. A different government might have different policies that may be alarming to others. So there's definitely two sides to this sword.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So we move now to our time for questions. What we normally do in these sessions, for those of you who haven't been before, is to collect up questions, and then we go back round the panel. So it's not a kind of Q&A, it's a kind of batch of questions for the panel. So if you would like to ask something, please raise your little electronic hand and I will come to you shortly. Please keep the questions brief so that we can maximize the number that we get through. And obviously, if you prefer to ask your question in the chat, that's also open to you to do so. I see Malcolm with a hand up. Malcolm, you're muted. There we are.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and very good contributions, and also my thanks particularly to Lindsay as well for all the work she's done on this. And now, as many of you will know, I have a very focused engagement with encouraging more use of public procurement to drive innovation. And in that respect, I've been having a close look not just at the NPPS, which is very encouraging in that result, by the way. If you look at it, in fact, it has some quite sort of open language, encouraging people to be flexible and innovation-minded, and to use procurement in that framework. And indeed, the encouragement of innovation is included as a key element of the government's growth mission. So we've had a lot of discussion so far about the legal definition. I mean, for me, I'm interested in how people are going to change behavior and how much the NPPS is going to influence that. So there's going to be a lot more work to do, hopefully, with this group to discuss some of these things, because the second point I wanted to make is, and I put this in the chat for you, I wondered how many of you have actually read the press release that accompanied this. Because the press release is very interesting, because it actually opens up new possibilities. It says that the government is looking for some possible new legislation to encourage local procurement, but particularly there's going to be a new commercial innovation hub which is described very interestingly as being the golden thread that's going to encourage collaboration across government. So those are the things that I'm going to be looking for. And I also want to know how people are going to use the competitive flexible procedure, and that as a piece of research, which I'm particularly interested in, and chairing a research group, is something that I really do think we need to start collecting some early data on.
Fantastic, thank you. Great questions there. Anybody else wanting to come in with a question? We've got also lots of good stuff in the chat. So lots of interest today in SMEs and how they can be encouraged to participate more in procurement processes, bit of concern around frameworks, lots of discussion of the use of data and the possibilities for tech and AI. Samantha, I see you with a hand raised. What would you like to?
My question is, will the new targets around SMEs in procurement actually drive people, commissioners away from using grant as an alternative tool for working with voluntary and community organisations?
Great question. Thank you very much indeed for that contribution. Okay, I think then what we'll do is just go back round our panel in the same order that we met them before, and please feel free to pick out anything from those questions or anything from the chat or anything from your colleagues' presentations that you would like to very quickly comment on in the 2 minutes available to you. So Lindsay, if you can bear before your holiday to discuss this again. Any final thoughts from you?
I don't actually have a holiday booked. It's like a hypothetical holiday at the moment, which I need to get on and do. But yeah, I think there's some good debate, and I think inevitably when we kind of come and discuss this, there is always a little bit of a split between what is actually relevant to the legislation, what legislation does, versus what is good practice and behavioural change, and all of the stuff around how can you break down barriers for SMEs if people aren't following, what is good commercial practice in relation to market engagement. So I think one of the things for me that we've learnt from this process is that alongside this change, having those communities of practice, having the ability to share what is working well, and this goes to Malcolm's point as well around innovation and competitive flexible, is really important. So actually the legislation is one thing, but we should kind of really focus on what our procurement community can drive together and share those examples, because that's how you sort of encourage change. So the more championing of that, and the more sharing of ideas, and the more kind of cascading of those sort of very specific responses to very specific market challenges, I think are probably going to be quite powerful. And that's up to you. That's everyone on this call can drive that forward. You don't need to navigate anything around the legislation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lindsay. Jane, any responses or concluding thoughts from you?
Actually, yes, I've just been. I thought I'd posted my response to some of the questions. I think the questions and the comments that are coming through in the chat, I think, are really telling in terms of what next. And I think the focus is really very much on small businesses. It's very much on how we're going to do more with less, how we're going to meet expectations, how we're going to improve payment processes. It seems that we've got the right mechanisms in place. So I think collectively we just need to make sure that this is the start of new opportunities rather than doing more of the same that we've always done. And I'm really, really hopeful that this is going to really change things for us. But I think having events like this to keep these debates and discussions going, I think is going to be critical, because that's when you do really highlight the different perspectives that everybody has here. And actually, I don't think there are any surprises in the comments that have been put forward or the points raised by people in the panel here. And they're not new things. They're not new challenges. They're old. They've been going on for a long time. So I think the hope is here that we really hope that this is this is a pivotal moment really in the public sector, where what we've seen previously is a lot of economic stimulus packages going on to help and support businesses. And we've seen grants and so on helping the public sector to do things more innovatively. What I'd like to see now is it all coming together. And so the thought of that those commercial groups, I think, is going to be really welcome. But also, I hate to say it, but the linchpin, yeah, here for sure. Always got to keep a sense of humour in this heavy world that we live in. But yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Anne.
And thank you, Jane, for those thoughts. Richard, any concluding thoughts from you?
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating discussion, and I've really enjoyed reading the chat. I can suggest, Lindsay, the other question people ask me, apart from what on earth is procurement, is, oh, you live in Pembrokeshire, that's a nice place for holidays, so you can always come down here. Some of us live in our holiday homes. So, okay, a couple of things, just briefly. Doing more with less. Somebody said to me once, a chap called Simon Davis, excellent buyer, for those of you who know Simon, he just said, look, Rich, he said, eventually less is actually just less. So eventually what we will be doing in procurement is less. You've got to decide what to let go. And if you can do some of that through collaboration and procurement, through just working with other sectors, working with new people, working in different ways, then that's, I'm afraid, what we're going to have to do. We're well used to this idea that we're going to have to do more with less resource. Capability and capacity is a real problem in procurement right now. We do have a program to bring new people on. It's a very exciting program. We're working with our educational establishments to do that, but it's a long-term fix to a short-term problem. The truth is we don't have the senior people. People are retiring, people are leaving the profession. So we're expected to do new things, new commercial type of thing, with people who've been doing procurement for years. Procurement in some places as well can be a dirty word. Commercial is much more fashionable, sometimes change, but really the business is all about helping councils to deliver their frontline services. All of this money we spend, and in Wales, councils spend about £5.5 billion a year on bought in goods and services. It's not procurement spend, it's spend through procurement that's delivering frontline services. So as such, when we're looking at the make or buy, some of that will perhaps be better done as a make. Some of it might be better done as a buy, but you really just need, or we really need to be better at the way we do that. And I'll just be quick, but one thing that's been mentioned a few times today is supply chain. Couldn't agree more. We have the immediate subject matter, the immediate people that we're contracting with. I think Rory mentioned the contracting process and the fact that we focus on that sort of competition. He's dead right. The competition is just part of it. It's a means to an end. The objective is to get business relationships that work. Business relationships that deliver for public services, and that whole business doesn't just involve procurement professionals, it involves people across the piece. It's an organizational level responsibility. So there's an awful lot we can do there around the whole supply chain, the whole piece, and perhaps looking at it differently. And I urge you not to hyper focus on the models, rather let the procurement specialists work out how to work with the models, but let's work on those big objectives and just doing things better than we've been doing them in the past, because there's unlimited opportunity to do that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. I don't know whether Kate is still with us.
I am.
There you are. Kate, any concluding thoughts from you?
Yes, I'm not going to put my camera on just because of the bandwidth. But so 2 points, I think. I think it's fantastic to hear the focus on SMEs and how this can all be used for the positive. A word of caution is that we're hearing from the very big suppliers that they are concerned about the additional scrutiny of their supply chains. And therefore, there is a risk, I think, that they will turn to their tried and tested larger tier 1, tier 2 subcontractors and be more reluctant to branch out into the SME market, where they are feeling pressure in relation to full supply chain scrutiny. So I think that is a risk that we should all help them navigate, and that shouldn't be the default. And then on the ministerial statement, I think it's just, for me, it was just a signal of things to come, and that this is a moving process and a moving market, and that we should be all hoping to contribute to kind of continuing to develop the legislation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Kieran.
Yes, thank you, Anne. So just going to return briefly to some of the other panelists' comments. First up, I completely agree with what Lindsay said about this being as much about behavioural change as much as legal change. I think that's an important point. This was all headlined transforming public procurement. But we have to remember this is transforming procurement law, and I think to transform public procurement, you have to transform the actual procurement, not just the kind of legal parameters. That's an important thing to keep in mind, and some of the things that people have talked about, like SME engagement. And I'm sure we all agree Lindsay's hypothetical holiday is well deserved to become a real holiday, so hopefully get that in the diary, Lindsay. Jane, then, I think really interesting comments about capacity constraints. The challenge of having to do more with less. And I think, you know, it's easy to come to these sessions and make very high level observations, but it's how this will be applied in practice. That's a really important struggle for many contracting authorities. Peter had also put a comment in the chat about capacity and skill set, which, you know, I would agree with, particularly my experience of working with local government authorities. Apart from Richard's general humour and positivity, I like this point about local priorities and a local mandate. So there's a lot of talk about this national procurement policy statement. Good not to forget our local priorities. Again, there is that democratic local mandate on terms of how they might want to use procurement as a tool. Interesting comments from Kate about debarment and legal challenges, and also laterally about SME reluctance. Personally not convinced this is all the game changer for SMEs that some have made out. We will soon find out. Really interesting comments from Michael as ever about the added layers of complexity and the impact on frameworks. I do think, I've joked about it previously, but I do think framework providers will probably be some of the early beneficiaries of this new regime. I did have a good laugh at Rory's example about the contract manager refusing that they were the contract manager. Whilst it was in jest, there is an element of truth in these kind of conversations, again, in our own personal experiences. You know, on a more serious note, I think that contract management is going to be very important. And finally, just to wrap up some of the comments in the chat, again, where we know the policy goals, SMEs. We had a panel event a while back from the Procurement Lawyers Association entitled, "Can Public Procurement Achieve All That Is Expected of It?" Now, I wasn't able to attend the event, unfortunately, but I'm guessing the answer was probably no. I think we just need to be careful about tagging on too many policy expectations, too many things that deviate from what we would associate with traditional procurement. So anyway, that's my thoughts, and thanks very much for the invite.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Michael.
I'll have to be lawyerly here, but if the plan is to use procurement to drive innovation, the sort of mission economy goal, it is obviously important that we don't just procure things, but we actually do the things that we've procured. This country has been spectacularly bad at doing that, particularly in the sorts of projects that we think that might actually be achieving the mission economy. Now, this government and previous government has been very focused on how to try and get things better delivered, get things delivered more effectively. Looking at a range of things, such as, for example, the planning regime, but a range of other things. I have a little concern that, at least in the short term, that this act may create another little obstacle. It's, you know, we have all of these innovations around SME obligations regarding SMEs, the have regard obligations regarding the NPPS, and of course the Welsh PPS. But we don't actually have any clarity about how disputes are going to be resolved around this area. And we have to assume that there are going to be disputes because there is a lack of clarity, and these will be contentious issues. Presumably they're going to be resolved through judicial review or somehow, and that is going to take up some time. There is certainly the possibility of SMEs, SME bodies, civil society bodies to take a number of points. Indeed, the more that you have in the NPPS, the more scope there is for people to take points and potentially slow things down. I think it may be just an inevitability, but the quicker we can get to a point where some of those points are resolved and are clearer, so that this doesn't become yet another pinch point in actually delivering a mission economy project, the better.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Rory, any concluding thoughts from you?
Yeah, this has been a great session. Thank you for everyone involved. I'm curious about how the roles of public managers, procurement professionals, and others may evolve. Whether the roles before the procurement happens will evolve, and long after, the contract management stuff. Whether there'll be more engagement with sustainability officers within an organization. Like, I'm curious about what happens with the actual roles and the. I'm also curious about the use of the data that's being produced. So lots of, if we are getting more information from notices, who's actually using it? Is it helpful? What's the quality of the data? And I'm encouraged that Lindsay and I are co-chairing an advisory group around open contracting, and are talking about community of practice around data use. So, if attention to data use, whether you're a civil society organization or a public manager who's curious about what's going on in other levels of government, or a journalist, or other users of this information that's going to be published, or you're packaging the information for small businesses to understand and be able to engage. I think there's more opportunity to be engaged. This is one, I guess, waygate on a journey, I think, of behavioral change, and hopefully it's we're all moving in a positive direction. How we know that is a conversation for another day, but like, I'm really encouraged by this and appreciate all the I appreciate the session.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So what I'm going to do now is bring the formal proceedings to a close, with apologies to those of you who have still got questions that you would like to ask. We normally try to finish on time, but some of our panelists may be able to hang around afterwards. So if you want to hang around and pursue your questions, do feel free to do so. But just for those people who need to get away, we will bring the formal proceedings to a close now, with a massive thank you to our fantastic panelists for a really enjoyable session. And I'm particularly comforted by the thought that there's going to be plenty more to discuss as we see how the Act takes shape. So looking forward to continuing those conversations with all of you. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.